Rome, Olympic Stadium, July 1988. The Italian summer night hung heavy with anticipation. 90,000 bodies pressed together beneath a sky scattered with stars that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the collective heartbeat of the crowd. Every seat filled, every standing space claimed by those fortunate enough to have secured tickets to the European leg of the Bad World Tour. The massive stage stood at one end of the historic arena, its elaborate construction of lights, platforms, and technical equipment transformed into a temple of modern entertainment. As the opening acts concluded and the changeover began, the murmur of the crowd grew, swelling into waves of sound that crashed against the ancient walls that had witnessed spectacles for centuries. None, perhaps, quite like what was about to unfold. In that moment of building anticipation, as the house lights dimmed for the final time, 90,000 people collectively held their breath. The silence before the revelation. Behind the massive black curtain that concealed the stage, Michael Jackson stood motionless, his slender frame encased in the elaborate military-style costume that had become his signature for this tour. At 30 years old, he had achieved a level of global fame unprecedented in entertainment history. Recognized in the most remote villages of developing nations, his movements followed with religious devotion by millions, his artistic choices dissected with scholarly intensity. The weight of this reality pressed against him constantly, simultaneously validating and isolating. But in these final moments before emerging into the lights, before transforming from person to phenomenon, Michael found himself thinking not of the 90,000 waiting in the stadium, but of one. Earlier that day, during the standard meet and greet with local dignitaries and contest winners, he had encountered a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, in a wheelchair. The child, introduced as Marco, had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, his attendance at the concert arranged through a foundation that granted wishes to dying children. What had struck Michael wasn't just the boy's condition, but his eyes, enormous, luminous, filled with a wisdom that seemed ancient in his young face. When Michael had knelt to speak with him, the boy had whispered something that penetrated the carefully constructed armor of celebrity. "When you dance, I can feel my legs move too." The encounter had lingered in Michael's mind throughout the day, through soundcheck and costume fitting and the precise physical preparation that preceded every performance. Now, as his dancers took their positions and the band began the instrumental introduction that would build to his entrance, Michael made a decision that would deviate from the meticulously planned production that had been performed identically in cities across 3 continents. His longtime stage manager noticed immediately the subtle shift in Michael's posture, telegraphing his intent. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, recognizing the signs of spontaneous artistic intuition that had produced some of Michael's most memorable moments. Michael's eyes, unusually expressive in contrast to his carefully composed features, met his manager's with rare directness. "The boy in the wheelchair," he said. "Marco, where is he seated?" The manager, accustomed to facilitating Michael's vision rather than questioning it, immediately grasped the implications. "Front section, house left, special access area. Row 3. Michael nodded once, a slight movement containing absolute certainty. "Tell Giovanni to bring the spotlight there, after human nature, and make sure security understands what's happening." The manager hesitated only briefly before nodding. In a production of such scale and precision, last-minute changes carried significant risk. But he had witnessed too many moments of Michael's uncanny artistic intuition to question this one. When Michael Jackson finally emerged onto the Olympic Stadium stage, the response was seismic, a wall of sound that seemed to physically press against him, a tangible force composed of 90,000 voices releasing months, years, sometimes decades of anticipation in a single explosive moment. He stood motionless in the spotlight, absorbing it, allowing it to wash over and through him. This moment, the first appearance, the initial connection with an audience, had always been among his favorites, a rare instance where the exchange of energy between performer and witness was at its most pure, uncomplicated by expectation or judgment. Tonight, That moment stretched longer than usual, Michael remaining still as the ovation continued, showing no sign of diminishing. He closed his eyes briefly, committing the sound to memory, knowing that what would unfold later in the show might forever alter the relationship between himself and this particular audience. The first hour of the concert unfolded with the precision and spectacle that had become his hallmark. Each song was a self-contained theatrical experience. Want to be starting something with its infectious rhythm that unified the massive crowd and movement. Smooth Criminal, with its gravity-defying lean that still defied logical explanation. Beat It, with its stylized confrontation transformed into dance. The audience responded with increasing fervor to each familiar hit, each iconic move. But those who had seen Michael perform before, those who had followed the tour through multiple cities, might have noticed subtle differences. Between songs, his usual economy of movement and speech gave way to moments of surprising connection. Extended eye contact with audience members in the front rows, small gestures of acknowledgement directed at specific sections of the stadium. It was as if he was gathering energy, building towards something unplanned but increasingly necessary. As the final notes of Bad concluded, the stage fell into darkness, a brief interlude before the softer section of the show that would begin with Human Nature. In that darkness, Michael moved to the edge of the stage, kneeling to speak quickly with a security team member. Words were exchanged, nods of understanding, a brief touch on the shoulder conveying the importance of precise execution. When the lights returned, softer now, bathing the stage in gentle blue, Michael stood center stage, his military costume replaced with a simple white shirt that seemed to glow in the ethereal light. The opening synthesizer notes of Human Nature emerged from the darkness, a gentle invitation rather than a command. Michael's voice, when it joined the music, carried a vulnerability rarely revealed in the high-energy numbers that dominated the show's first half. The audience responded with a collective shift in energy, lighters raised, bodies swaying in gentle unison, a communion of shared appreciation for this more intimate expression of artistry. As the song reached its bridge, Michael moved to the front of the stage, closer to the audience than the choreography usually allowed. His eyes scanned the front sections with unusual intentness until they settled on the special access area where Marco sat in his wheelchair, small face tilted up in rapt attention, illuminated by the soft glow of stage lights. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, artist and admirer connected by something that transcended the massive production surrounding them. Michael held the gaze as he continued singing, the lyrics about the city and night, now carrying additional layers of meaning about human connection, about seeing and being seen across divides of circumstance and experience. When the song concluded, Michael remained at the edge of the stage rather than moving to his mark for the next number. The band, consummate professionals attuned to his every signal, held in a musical holding pattern, extending the gentle conclusion of Human Nature without proceeding to the introduction of the next planned song. The audience, sensing deviation from the expected flow, quieted slightly, attention sharpening. Michael stepped to the microphone. Sometimes, he said, his speaking voice carrying that characteristic softness that always surprised those who knew him only through recordings, music is about more than entertainment. Sometimes it's about connection. The stadium had grown extraordinarily quiet, 90,000 people leaning in, collectively holding their breath at this unexpected moment of direct address. Tonight, I met someone who reminded me why I do this, why it matters. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments when the carefully constructed walls between artist and audience briefly dissolve, revealing the profound human connection that lies at the heart of all meaningful art. These glimpses behind the spectacle remind us why music matters beyond entertainment, how it creates bridges between experiences that might otherwise never touch. Michael gestured toward the special access area, and a spotlight gently illuminated Marco in his wheelchair, the boy's expression transforming from surprise to something approaching wonder as he realized he had become part of the show. The audience's attention followed the light, thousands of heads turning to see what had captured their idol's focus. "This is Marco," Michael continued, his voice carrying an unusual emotional openness. "Today he told me something I won't forget. He said, 'When you dance, I can feel my legs move too.'" The words hung in the air, their simple profundity settling over the massive space. In the spotlight, Marco's face registered recognition of his own words now shared with 90,000 strangers, his eyes widening with the realization that he had been not just seen but heard, not just acknowledged but valued. What happened next would be recounted differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some would say Michael had planned it meticulously, others that it was entirely spontaneous inspiration. The truth, as often happened with Michael Jackson's most powerful artistic moments, lay somewhere in between. Intuition guided by years of technical mastery, spontaneity channeled through absolute command of his craft. As the band began to play the opening notes of Man in the Mirror, Michael walked to the very edge of the stage, beckoning to security personnel stationed near Marco. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience as they tried to understand what was unfolding. Then, with a gentleness that belied the massive scale of the production, two security team members carefully lifted Marco from his wheelchair and carried him toward the steps at the side of the stage. The stadium had fallen into complete silence, tens of thousands of spectators collectively holding their breath as they watched this unplanned deviation from the meticulously choreographed show. Michael met Marco at the top of the stairs, kneeling to eye level with the boy as the security team carefully set him down, supporting him on either side. Words were exchanged, inaudible to the audience, but obviously meaningful from the expressions that passed between them. Then Michael straightened and signaled to his dancers, who quickly understood and moved into position, forming a loose circle around them. As the music built toward the first chorus, Michael did something that sent a visible wave of emotion through the stadium. He carefully lifted Marco into his arms, holding him with the secure confidence of someone who understood a child's need for both safety and dignity. What followed transcended performance to become something approaching ritual. As Michael sang about making a change, about looking at the man in the mirror, he began to dance. Not the elaborate choreography of his high-energy numbers, but a gentle, fluid movement that incorporated Marco as an extension of himself. The boy's arms wrapped around Michael's neck, his face transformed by an expression of pure joy as he experienced movement his own body could not provide. The dancers moved around them in a protective circle, their choreography adapted in real time to complement rather than compete with this central tableau. The audience, initially shocked into silence by the unexpected turn, now began to respond. First with scattered applause, then with a growing wave of sound that contained not just appreciation but recognition, empathy, the particular electricity that accompanies the witnessing of genuine human connection. As the song built toward its emotional peak, Michael carried Marco in a complete circle, allowing him to see and be seen by the entire stadium. The boy's face, projected on the massive screens that ensured visibility for those in the furthest seats, told a story more powerful than any choreographed spectacle. Pure joy, liberation, the transcendent experience of being fully included in a moment of collective celebration. When Michael finally returned to center stage, still holding Marco securely as he delivered the final chorus, the audience's response had transformed into something beyond typical concert reaction. This was sound as emotional release, as recognition of having witnessed something authentic in a context often defined by calculated spectacle. When the song concluded, Michael carefully returned Marco to his wheelchair, which had been brought to the side of the stage. But before releasing him to the care of the security team, he removed something from around his own neck, a small medallion on a silver chain, its significance known only to Michael himself. He placed it around Marco's neck, leaning close to speak words meant only for the boy. Marco's response, visible to those closest to the stage, was to reach up and touch Michael's face with a gesture of such natural affection, such unguarded gratitude, that many who witnessed it later described being moved to tears. The moment held, suspended in time, until Michael gently squeezed Marco's hand and straightened, allowing the security team to return the boy to his place in the audience. As Marco was carried back to the special access area, the audience's applause continued. Not the rhythmic demand for more entertainment, but a sustained expression of recognition for what they had just witnessed. Michael stood at the edge of the stage, watching until Marco was securely back in position. Then he turned to the wider audience, his face revealing more genuine emotion than the carefully composed expression he typically maintained. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting me share that with you." The words were unnecessary, the connection already established through the act itself, but they provided closure, acknowledgement of the collective nature of what had transpired. What no one in the stadium knew, what wouldn't become public knowledge until years later through a documentary about the tour, was that Michael had arranged for Marco and his family to receive ongoing medical support for experimental treatments not covered by Italy's National Health Service, for modifications to their home to improve Marco's quality of life. These arrangements have been made through anonymous channels, with strict instructions that the source of the assistance never be revealed. For Michael, the public moment on stage had been genuine expression, not calculated publicity. The private follow-through, invisible to all but a handful of necessary facilitators, reflected his understanding that true compassion extends beyond symbolic gestures into practical action. The remainder of the concert carried a different energy, the connection between performer and audience altered by their shared witness of vulnerability and inclusion. When Michael performed "Will You Be There" toward the show's conclusion, the song's plea for connection and support no longer seemed like artistic metaphor, but direct expression of a fundamental human need recognized across divides of fame, health, circumstance. The audience responded in kind, their energy shifting from spectator adulation to something approaching communion. Even the highest energy numbers that formed the show's finale seemed transformed, still technically brilliant, still visually spectacular, but now infused with emotional resonance that transcended entertainment. During the final bow, as Michael stood center stage, acknowledging the thunderous appreciation of 90,000 people who had experienced not just a concert, but a moment of genuine human connection, his eyes found Marco once more in the special access area. The boy sat in his wheelchair, the medallion visible against his shirt, his face alight with the particular radiance of someone who has been truly seen. Michael placed his hand over his heart, a small gesture directed not at the stadium as a whole, but at this one child who had unknowingly catalyzed a moment of transformation. Marco returned the gesture, his small hand pressed against his own heart, completing the circle of recognition that had begun with a whispered confidence during a brief meet and greet. In the days that followed, the media coverage of the Rome concert focused primarily on the spectacular production values, the commercial success, the cultural phenomenon that the Bad World Tour had become across Europe. Few mainstream outlets gave significant attention to the unplanned moment with Marco, perhaps because it defied easy categorization, perhaps because it contradicted the increasingly sensationalized narrative surrounding Michael Jackson's persona. But among those who had been present, the story spread through first-hand accounts, through the particular authority of "it was there, I saw it happen." Flight attendants who had traveled from Berlin specifically for the show told passengers on their return journey. American college students studying abroad wrote long letters home, describing not the elaborate staging or the moonwalk, but the moment when superstar and child had connected across seemingly insurmountable differences of experience. For Marco and his family, the impact extended far beyond that single night. The medical treatments arranged anonymously allowed him 2 additional years of life. Years filled with improved mobility, reduced pain, and the constant reminder that he had been seen, truly seen, by someone whose recognition carried its own form of healing. The medallion remained his most treasured possession, kept beside his bed during increasingly frequent hospital stays, clutched in his small hand during the difficult nights. When he finally passed away in the summer of 1990, his mother honored his request that it be buried with him. This tangible connection to a moment when his condition had not defined him, when he had been not object of pity, but participant in joy. Michael himself rarely spoke publicly about that night in Rome, about Marco, about the spontaneous deviation from choreographed spectacle to human connection. But those close to him noted that something had shifted in his approach to live performance afterward. The elaborate productions remained, the technical brilliance undiminished, but he increasingly found ways to create moments of genuine connection within the massive scale of stadium shows. Sometimes it was bringing a child from the audience on stage, sometimes stepping into the crowd despite security concerns, sometimes simply extending certain songs to allow for more direct engagement with specific audience sections. These moments were never identical, never formulaic, each responding to the particular energy of the night, the venue, the unspoken needs of both performer and audience. Years later, long after Michael had left this world too soon, that night in Rome would still be discussed, analyzed, celebrated. Music historians would place it in context. Fans would share increasingly detailed memories. New generations would discover the limited footage online and marvel at the natural grace with which a global superstar had temporarily set aside spectacle to create space for simple human connection. But perhaps the most telling testament came from a dancer who had been on stage that night, who had witnessed the unplanned moment from just feet away. Interviewed for a documentary in her 60s, decades after the event, she leaned forward in her chair, eyes bright with remembered wonder. In all my years of performing, with everyone from Madonna to Baryshnikov, I never saw anything like it, she said. It wasn't the technical execution, though of course Michael's ability to adapt his movement while securely holding a child was extraordinary. It was the quality of attention, complete, undivided, as if the stadium with 90,000 people had fallen away and there were just two humans connecting through movement. In this business, that kind of authentic presence is the rarest thing of all. The medallion itself remains with Marco, buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Rome. But its story continues to surface periodically, in specialized music publications, in academic studies of celebrity and compassion, in the oral histories of those who witnessed that night in Olympic Stadium. These retellings rarely capture the full complexity of what transpired, the layers of meaning contained in that unplanned moment when a global superstar and a terminally ill child found common ground in the universal language of movement. But they preserve the essential truth that sometimes, in rare and precious moments, the elaborate constructions of entertainment fall away to reveal the simple, profound connection that lies at the heart of all meaningful art. That fame, for all its distorting power, cannot completely obscure the fundamental human need to see and be seen, to touch and be touched, to remind each other that no condition, whether terminal illness or unprecedented celebrity, can fully separate us from our shared humanity. If this video has touched you, if it has reminded you that our deepest connections often emerge from our most vulnerable moments, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who understands that beneath the spectacle of entertainment lies art's true purpose: to bridge the distances between us, to create spaces where we can recognize ourselves and each other across all divides of circumstance and experience. And remember that in a world increasingly defined by virtual connection, by carefully curated presentation, the courage to be genuinely present with another human being may be our most revolutionary act. In a small music therapy room at a children's hospital in Milan, a framed photograph hangs on the wall, slightly faded now, clearly from another era. It shows Michael Jackson on the Olympic Stadium stage, holding a small boy in his arms, both faces alight with identical expressions of joy, of freedom, of the particular transcendence that comes from moving together to music that speaks to something beyond words. The therapist who uses this room never explicitly references the photograph during sessions. But sometimes, when working with children whose bodies have betrayed them, whose conditions have isolated them from typical experiences of childhood, she glances at it briefly for inspiration. Then she returns her full attention to the child before her, offering the same quality of complete presence, of recognition without pity, of connection through the universal language of music. In these moments, though none of the children or their families would know it, the legacy of that night in Rome continues. Not in spectacular production or global fame, but in the simple, profound truth that when we truly see each other, even briefly, something fundamental heals in both the seen and the seer.